Wow, what a beautiful way to start the day. Thank you both. And good morning, everyone. I am Amy Skillman, and I'm so pleased to welcome you to this morning's kickoff of the first Artist to Artist residency of the Susquehanna Folk Music Society. I'm here in the beautiful Kulkarni Theater at Penn State Harrisburg campus. And joining me today are violinist Cookie Segelstein. I knew I was going to mess that up. Segelstein, who is the founder of Beretsky Pass. She's joining us from California, so welcome early in the morning for her. And Ilene Stahl, who is, as you've seen, a clarinetist. And she is with Klezmer. And both of these are two of 5 really amazing, nationally recognized klezmer musicians that you will meet today. And I invite you to go to the Susquehanna Folk Music website to read more about them, where their links are posted. So this is the first of 4 workshop sessions, and this session is an opportunity to kind of get a taste of what's to come, but also to offer a little bit of background about klezmer music, especially for those of you who might not be familiar with this particular musical tradition. So we have an opportunity today to really learn from some of the best about this music. And I'd like to begin by asking the two of you to just tell us a little bit about the music that you just played. What is its role in klezmer music, and how does it fit into your repertoire? Ilene, you want to go first?
Sure. And this is a doina that I learned from the great clarinetist Dave Tarras. And I definitely also want to mention that I'm the clarinetist with the Klezmer Conservatory Band currently, and since '87. It's hard to believe. So this doina, this sort of free verse soliloquy kind of music, is, like most of the klezmer music that we play, part of the Jewish wedding tradition. And the name of this particular piece is Kalabazetzen, for seating the bride. In a traditional Jewish wedding, there is a lot of stuff that happens before the I do part of the standing together wedding ceremony. And one of them is that before the wedding, the groom is somewhere else with his male family members and friends, and the bride is seated at usually a fancy decorated chair, attended by her female relatives and friends, and she is a queen. She is literally a queen for the day. And this piece of music is part of that. This piece of music was, I guess, imagined by Dave Tarras and played for this seating. And also in the doina, the role of this piece of music is also to, usually in a traditional Jewish wedding, although we rarely see this today, there's someone called a barchen, who is sort of a master of ceremonies, and whose role is to narrate the festivities with comedy, but also with pathos. You know, the doina doesn't sound happy. It's sad. It is meant to elicit tears, perhaps because the bride is about to leave her family and go live with her husband's family. It's a poignant and scary moment.
Okay, how about the piece you played?
Well, I actually improvised. I didn't know which doina that Irene was going to play, but what I did is I did the doina is actually one of the listening forms of klezmer music. It's not a dance form. It was, and what Ilene played Kalabazetzen, a seating of the bride, which has a little different harmony than a traditional Jewish doina. which is probably taken from the Romanian doina, which is much more harmonically complicated. The typical Jewish doina just has a few key areas. Even though most people don't play those typical key areas, I did it anyway because we're in a discussion right now. And so even though, I played in improvisation, I did follow a certain form. I didn't follow the length of different key areas. And in real life, if Ilene and I were on stage and we were trading a doina, she'd probably play one for 4 or 5 minutes. I would play one for 4 or 5 minutes. Mm-hmm. But we kind of gave you, and by the way, that's one of my favorite, that Terrace Kalabazetsins, that's one of my favorites, which has a different harmony setup than the doina. It's very similar, and it goes into similar key areas, but it starts out with a little different thing. So as Ilene said, this would have been used in some cases not only just for the seating of the bride and the ceremony of unveiling the bride, which comes from the biblical, was it Jacob who was forced to marry Leah, or Joseph? One of the J guys in the Bible, had to, that he was tricked by the father and he married Leah. I think it was Leah. It's been a long time.
I looked it up last night because I was worried.
Is it Leah? And then he really wanted to marry Rachel, I think, or Ruth, one of the R people. And you can see I'm unencumbered by the need of facts. But this would have also been used for the musicians, for the unveiling, so that the groom, this might be the first time the groom sees the bride, to make sure it's the right one. Also might have been used at the wedding table to entertain the father of the bride or the whole family. And it's also when the klezmer musicians might get paid. So it's kind of where there might have been a little bag on the fiddler's scroll, leaning into the father, and hopefully some gold coins would go in there.
Oh, great. Wonderful. Well, they both were, it was really beautiful, and what a great way to start our day today. It's such an honor to be here with both of you. Ilene, I know that the clarinet is certainly one of the featured sounds of a klezmer group. And I'm wondering if you can talk a little bit about the sound that you're trying to achieve when you play. For instance, I understand that sometimes the instrumentation is meant to maybe invoke a voice. Or to replicate a voice. But I'm wondering if you can talk a little bit about that instrumentation and what makes it distinctly klezmer. So kind of getting at what are some of the aesthetics of klezmer music, and how does one recognize klezmer?
Well, I didn't grow up with this music, and I am a classically trained clarinetist a long time ago already. It's been a very long time since I played classical music. But, I think that for most wind players, we are, and probably other instrumentalists too, we're always taught to sing through our instrument. And so from my earliest serious music lessons, I aspire to do that. But the difference is that in klezmer music, you have to sing in Yiddish. And, in classical music, your model for how to sing is perhaps an opera singer, someone singing bel canto music, an elevated kind of singing. And in klezmer music, I am aspiring to be the voice of an ordinary person and to express the sighs and the joy and the cries and the consternation of an ordinary speaker. And the clarinet is very well suited to be able to make these sounds. One of the key sounds that I had to learn to make is called a krechts. It's like a cry, but it's also a sigh. And really the artistry of learning to put this music across is to do this in a subtle and calibrated way. I think for myself, when I came to this music from classical music, it was such a liberation that it felt like, wow, this is a free-for-all. I can do whatever I want. And I have ushered many other classically trained clarinetists back in to understanding that klezmer music has its own aesthetics and its own rules and its own elegance. It's not primarily broad, and it's a subtle form with its own aesthetic.
That's really beautiful. And I know that you are particularly known for your sort of soulful performance with the clarinet. I think people are particularly drawn to that sort of very emotional, soulful way that you play your instrument. So that's really beautiful. I love that. So thinking, continuing a little bit more with this idea of what is klezmer music. Cookie, I recently read an interview with you where you said there is no typical klezmer, which I thought was really fascinating, but you also talked about key elements or klezmer elements within music that you yourself are composing. So can you talk a little bit about what you mean by there isn't a typical klezmer, but also, you know, how do you identify those sort of klezmer elements when you're in your own work?
Well, that quote was taken a little bit, I mean, I did say that, and actually he put in part of it, and, you know, he couldn't put in everything that I said. What I meant is that, you know, today, because we have the internet, we really do have a global sound in a way. You know, a klezmer musician who's starting out in, you know, the southern part of England can go online and find Ilene or find me or find Lauren or the Susans or anybody and emulate the style. But in Eastern Europe, especially, you know, pre-World War II, styles were, I think, and, you know, there's some arguments in the Jewish community. There is some argument about the thought about this, that you know, there were regional styles. So there would be a Jewish sensibility and a Jewish style within whatever the region was. So, for instance, I grew up with two family members from what was at the time Czechoslovakia, but where my father was from, which was Veretsky, which is why our group is called Veretsky Pass. It was a very Ukrainian style. So I grew up playing for him and for the family in a different style that when I first went to Klez Camp, the Living Traditions organization in the early 90s, there were certain tunes that were familiar, but the style was not. So the style that I grew up with had a very open string, fiddly Ukrainian sound. And so, you know, I kind of adapted my style to what I then was exposed to at Klez Camp and at Klezmer conferences and festivals. But I did grow up with that style of music, and I think that, like in a traditional American fiddle style, you would follow the fiddler. You know, this fiddler plays this way, so his devotees play that way, and I think it was probably very similar in Eastern Europe.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So you mentioned Klez Camp as, you know, I think both of you participated in that. And in one of the workshops this afternoon, you'll have an opportunity, I think, to talk more about the experiences of being women in this world of klezmer music. But I want to talk a little bit now about the Klezmer Revival. You know, both of you have talked about being classically trained, and yet you're both thriving in this traditional music world. So, you know, some people say, in fact, that klezmer sort of was reinvented in the 1970s, and I think that was partly in response to the bicentennial of the United States and the kind of reemergence or the emergence of the folk song revival and kind of, you know, interest in roots music and all of that. it kind of fueled all of that. But Ilene, you have even referred to this in some of our earlier conversations as like a Klezmer Awakening, which is then became the title of this session. So I would love if you could talk a little bit about that revival for you and that sort of awakening for you, that personal connection.
I grew up in a family of music lovers, but not musicians. And so, my school had a band program, a very strong school band program, and that's when I started playing the clarinet. And when it seemed like maybe this was a thing that I was maybe going to be good at, I was on a track of classical clarinet lessons, which is, what you would do. Mm-hmm. And I grew up going to a lot of music concerts, but they were primarily classical music concerts or light opera. My home was full of cultural stuff, but I didn't know about exotic ethnic music, and I certainly didn't know about this music, even though my mother's father, who was in my life when I was growing up, was directly from Eastern Europe. Ironically, he was just leaving this mortal coil at the time when I heard klezmer music, which was in college. I took kind of a what we used to call back then world music survey course called Music of the Whole Earth. It was taught by this professor at Amherst College who had written this musicology book that was sort of fashioned after the Whole Earth catalog, very 1970s. And
I remember that.
And it really, hearing somebody play the clarinet this way just blew my mind. And it was kind of like I always knew that there must be more, but when I was growing up, it was like a Chinese restaurant, old-fashioned menu. It was like column A was classical and column B was Benny Goodman, and there was nothing else. I had to pick one. And then when I went to college and was studying classical clarinet, it was even more strict. It was classical clarinet in the French style or classical clarinet in the German style. So when I heard somebody playing this, and actually Don Byron of the Klezmer Conservatory Band was the first klezmer clarinetist I ever heard, I was so thrilled that there was this other kind of music. And then I was also surprised, as a person who is a very secular person, but a very Jewish secular person, that there was this whole other non-religious way to be Jewish and celebrate that, and an entire music and culture around this. Mm. And, whereas my parents probably never went to a wedding where there was a Kala Buzetzen, because when they were growing up, it wasn't that cool to be ethnic. They were certainly Jewish, but it's interesting that in the Klezmer Music Revival, by having access to this wedding music, a lot of people like me, who are secular Jews, reclaimed a lot of these wedding traditions that were once only experienced in very religious communities.
That's really interesting. Cookie, I don't know if you have a similar kind of awakening experience story to share.
I actually came to music starting with folk, rebelling and going to classical, coming back to folk.
Oh, interesting.
So I was handed a violin at 5, and I was expected to play. And my father would sing to me or yell. And, when you're being taught that way, you learn very quickly. So I was trotted out at all kinds of, holiday dinners. And so my parents are both Holocaust survivors. And the house was always filled with what we called refugees, the Grine, the greenhorns. And so I was the entertainer, and I hated it. It was like the worst thing, it was living. I thought, when I would kind of hear a little Polish and a little Yiddish and a little this, and I'd go, oh God, no, no, don't make me take out the violin. And I'd get my baseball glove and I'd start to run outside. Just a minute, come and spiel, come here and spiel. And so I was like, oh, hated it. And so my rebellion in high school, I switched to from violin to viola. And I thought, well, my parents don't know what that is, so I'm going to major in viola. That was a big rebellion. I mean, I did other things that I can't talk about here, but that was my big rebellion. And I went away from it, and I studied classical music. I got my master's degree in classical music. I played in the orchestra. I wanted nothing to do with it until I had my first child. So when you're pregnant with your first child and you have the history of the Holocaust survivors in your family, the questions are going to come up. Mm-hmm. So I kind of started getting drawn, and at this time, Klezmer Revival had been in full swing for about 8-10 years. And there was a group of people playing in New Haven, Connecticut, where I lived, and I kind of started to dabble in it and realizing I'm going to have to answer a lot of questions for my kids. I'm going to have to tell them some really dark, sad stuff. So I might as well show them some happy tunes also. So I started to play, just kind of dabble, and then somebody in the New Haven Symphony where I was, it was Adrienne Greenbaum, tapped me on the shoulder and she goes, hey, I heard you play Jewish. And I said, how much does it pay? I still wasn't quite. And so we did a bar mitzvah. And then I thought, okay, I'm going to kind of come back to this music. But what's interesting is I didn't associate the music I grew up with the Klezmer Revival music. I thought it was two separate Jewish things. It didn't sound exactly the same. Then I went to Klez Camp, that was started by Henry Sapoznik, and in 92, and I sat in on Alicia Spigel's class, her violin class, and she taught a tune, and then, I think it was Steve Greenman, one of my friends, and he taught a tune, and I said, well, I know that tune, but I know it differently. And then it dawned on me, because it was never called klezmer music at home. It was called Yiddish music, music from back home. It dawned on me that these were the same things. So I then kind of came back. I started to interview my father. My mother's tone deaf. My mother's still alive. My father died in 2000. But I started to interview him about the traditions of the music groups in his town. And he didn't want to talk to me at first. He said, Bach and Brahms and Mozart, what do you need this music? This is the music of thieves and people who sleep in a bar. And I said, well, I'll go ask Zucker, who was the rival tailor in Kansas City. He said, Zucker doesn't know anything. Then he told me all this stuff, But I had this plethora of riches of these refugees, Zucker being one of them, really, who I started to ask questions. I would come back to visit my folks, and I started to kind of reclaim, I guess, reawaken myself, the Jewish part of playing. Mm-hmm. And, so now moving here to California 10 years ago, I kind of gave up my symphony work, which I'd done for about 30 years. Mm-hmm. I didn't want to re-audition in my 50s for orchestras. Yeah. And plus Varetsky Pass has been based in Berkeley for 18 years. And so most of the playing I do and work I do is with this kind of music now.
Yeah. Wow. That's great. I love the notion that your first child also sort of launched you into reflecting on and thinking about what is that heritage that you have that you could pass on to those children. So, right. Yeah. That's great. So you talked a little bit about interviewing people, and much traditional music is sort of learned kind of at the knees of older musicians, and at the by attending or participating in the kinds of events where this music is passed on, like weddings or community dances or that sort of thing. But I've also noticed that there seems to be a great deal of careful and thoughtful research that informs a lot of the klezmer music. And I think most of the women that are participating today are probably some of those key researchers in this area. And I think, the revival is probably largely thriving partly because of that research, whether it's first person primary research, interviewing people, or going into collections. And I know you've been doing some interesting research. I wonder if you could talk a little bit about that, Cookie, and what are you looking for in the research that you're doing, and what excites you in the discoveries that you make?
Well, I'm very lucky to be surrounded by friends and family that are also researchers. I mean, my husband Josh Horowitz is I knew about him because of he was living in Austria and traveling into Eastern Europe with his Sony Walkman and some cartons of Camel cigarettes and vodka, and going into towns and meeting with musicians who claim to have played with Jews, or actually finding old Jewish musicians. In my case, kind of studying the music of the surrounding cultures of Veretsky, where my father was from, is fascinating to me, because it's kind of like that spot in Kansas where you can see 6 states. There was Poland, there was Hungary, Czechoslovakia, and the ethnic groups in his town, a very tiny town, were many: Ukrainians, Hutsul, Russians, Germans, Hungarians, Romanians. I mean, so the style was such a melting pot. So so when we have done our projects in our group, what we try to do is go back to as far back as we can, any research that's been done, the stuff that my husband did, going into collections and hand copying some of the music. Also, we've done a couple of projects with the clarinetist Joel Rubin, who's done a lot of research. Stu Brotman, our bass player, went into Romania with his first wife and crashed a wedding that turned out to be a Jewish wedding, and recorded the whole thing. So we've taken some of those tunes. What's exciting to me is to hear the way at that moment when that recording was done, whether it was on a Sony Walkman or in the cases of some of the field work that was done in the 1920s by Soviet collectors like Moishe Beregovsky and the Ansky expedition, and Sophia Mageed, who was a Soviet collector. We just did a project about her collections. To hear, actually, even if it's scratchy, matter of fact, the more scratchy, the better.
Yeah.
What was played at that moment. And in this last project we did, that was, we called it the Mageed Chronicles, and we took out of her 600 recordings that she did on wax cylinder, there were almost 100 that were instrumental. To hear the violin style of where she was collecting. And what I heard in this last project was a different way of playing accompaniment than everybody's been teaching. And It blew the top off my head. I was so excited, because we've always told people, don't play the harmony, don't play the thirds when you're doing, when you're accompanying people. And the sekun should be kind of short and rhythmic. And what I heard was, and I was like, whoa, do you hear that? And so it just kind of, I guess I love when my preconceptions are broken.
Yeah.
And for me, because I can't go back to the homes where my folks are from. I never met my grandparents, of course, they perished. This is like a family album for me. So for me to hear that is like, okay, well, I can go back to that time. I can go back to 1911. And that's kind of my little family photo album in a way.
Mm-hmm. Wow, that's powerful. I love that. And so that actually brings me to a question about kind of sustainability and the future. Maybe the two of you could talk a little bit about what you're doing now to keep this music going, to ensure that it is passed on.
Early on in the Klezmer Revival, there was a lot of controversy about straying from presenting this music in a very repertory, archivalist, true, authentic way. Mm-hmm. And you can understand that tension, because this music was essentially being for most people, rediscovered in the 1970s. You know, a lot of the musicians who played this music in Eastern Europe were killed. And when people came to the United States, and when Jews came to the United States, there were sad memories back home. Mm-hmm. And also the state of Israel was being formed, and there was enormous emphasis on a Jewish identity with this new kind of pioneer Israeli culture. Mm-hmm. And so aside from maybe a scene going on in New York, there wasn't a lot of klezmer music going on. On the other hand, klezmer musicians have always, just like every working musician, had to have ears open to what the popular music of the day was, what the popular dances were, and have that be part of the repertoire. So I think that many of us have come around, most of us have come around to, we can't pretend that we've never heard any other kind of music. There is no pure music form that isn't, or art form that isn't a thing. And so as the Klezmer Revival's gone on, there have been a second wave and a third wave and maybe even a fourth wave. And it kind of goes back and forth. So in the second wave, bands like my band Klezperanto said, all right, we're deeply steeped in this klezmer tradition, but for me personally, I love Latin dance music, and I especially love cumbia music. It's like a big band tradition. It comes from Colombia. It uses many of the same instruments that we use in a traditional American early klezmer band, and that was enormously exciting to me. And so I wanted to make a band where I could play this. And also, I'm a clarinet player, and I wanted access to rock and roll. And I totally picked the wrong instrument. So that was not going to happen unless I made it happen. Mm-hmm. And, you know, in the Klezmer Revival, like the third wave was kind of people going back to even like coming to America, like almost back to very traditional, quieter parlor music, kind of playing klezmer music with without brass instruments and drums. And now there's a fourth wave, but I'm really happy that the future of klezmer music is bright. There's been Klez Camp, which is certainly where I came up in the Klez world, and now there's Klez Canada and Yiddish New York, and there's all this stuff going on in Europe, and there are all these young people who are coming to this music, and they have a lot of resources that we didn't have at the beginning of the Klezmer Revival. And they're wonderful players, and the future of this music is bright.
Yeah. That's great. So it makes me think of the importance, I think, of innovation within tradition, right? To its sustainability is that need for innovation in order to keep the music fresh and alive and moving. Cookie, what about you? What kinds of things what is your perspective on the future of klezmer music?
Well, I 100% agree with what Ilene said, and I think that when we brought this music out of let's not to be dramatic, but really out of the ashes, right? We really did bring this music out. And as Ilene said, it was painful. The memories of the Jewish history was painful for those Jews when they came to America. No different, of course, in my family. Even though I played for the holidays, they did not want to play this music at home too much. It made them cry. And that's one of the reasons I hated it, because I'd play, they'd cry, and I was like, well, this sucks. That's no fun for a kid. So to actually, when Klez Camp came about, and you saw from infants up through really elderly folks, and then you watch these infants grow up in this scene. And so for them, the music is just natural. It's what they've grown up with. And now these young people, like Michael Winograd, and I mean, who's now, he's not young. Sorry, he's young, but he's not a baby anymore. And he's an amazingly, busy contractor, creator, composer, everything. I mean, a lot of these kids that grew up are now teaching the younger generation. Mm-hmm. Now, in my own teaching studio, I have about 23 kids. And I have some kids who really do not want to open the Suzuki book. And they're not really drawn to classical music. So I've taken a lot of this music as well as other folk music and determined, okay, this child needs to work on string crossing. So how about if I use this honga that just uses 2 strings? So I've taken a lot of this music and I teach it to my students, Jewish and non-Jewish, who seem to be drawn towards, say, the modes and the scales of that we're using. So I've made what I call the family jam book. I have jam book 1. I'm working on jam book 2 that starts from the easiest polka that uses 5 notes to a kolameki or to a bulgar or freilich that goes all over the place, and to promote families playing at home. And so that book is filled with some other traditions also, because I wanted a well-rounded thing. So my feeling is to expose these little violin players to the idea that, the Western music they study is a fraction of what's out there. And then, especially the kids who are growing up in Jewish homes, it's a way for them also to access a history that is getting more and more distant.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Wow. That's great. So both of you are just doing such wonderful, innovative work in terms of promoting this music and innovating on it. I really love that. I have one other question for each of you. How does it feel when you play this music? How do you feel when you play this music?
Oh my goodness. How does any musician feel when they're playing music? I mean, gosh, you feel how you feel that particular day depending on what's going on in your life, If the coffee pot broke and, you were out of creamer and like your car won't start, you have all of that and you're going to play somebody's wedding. It's the most joyous day in their, we hope, the most joyous day in their life so far. And so you bring all your passion and all your life experience and all the aggravations that maybe you share with somebody else who had to get to that wedding on time. And, we are people doing our job, coming to the office to do our work, just like every other person comes to their office or their workplace to do theirs.
Interesting. Yeah. How about you, Cookie?
I guess, what's interesting is that whenever as Ilene said, musicians have a certain relationship with our instruments. And there's a certain thing that happens when I put my bow on the string and the horsehair catches the string. It feels to me like when I used to go swimming. And as soon as I got in the water and I put my head under the water and everything else was blocked out, that was kind of my peace. It's like I feel when I step foot on the trail and my husband says, "Is this a quiet walk or a talking walk?" And I'll say, "It's a quiet walk." Mm-hmm. It's that I'm right where I am. So I think also because there is a sense for me about connecting with my ancestors. There really is. And so I know that, when I play classical music, I play viola in classical music. That's my instrument. That's what my master's degree is in. And, I definitely, when I'm sitting, if I'm sitting in front of a music stand and I'm playing whatever's there, I'm in that. But when I play this music, I guess maybe because I started out playing this music, I feel no stress. I mean, I'll feel my day stress, but I don't worry about getting it right. I'm just, I can actually, while I'm playing it, I can think about other things, because it was my first time I put a bow on a string was to, play this a version of this stuff as a child would. Um, and it's a really interesting feeling. It's really this kind of connection, I guess.
Mm.
And with everything else that comes into your day, and if I'm doing a job, if I'm at playing a wedding and I have to keep my eye on the caterer and my eye on the mother of the bride and control the drummer or whatever, I mean, that's part of the job, but there's
Sure.
all that connection, I guess. Not to be dramatic, but to my ancestors, honestly.
Yeah. Wow, that's really beautiful. So I want to thank both of you so much, Cookie for getting up so early to join us this morning, and Ilene for joining us from Massachusetts, where you live, and for sharing your thoughts and your passions and your stories with us. I know you're part of the upcoming workshops for the rest of the day, so hopefully everybody will tune in. I think our next workshop begins at 11:15 with two other musicians, Susan Leviton and Lauren Brody, who are going to be doing a workshop on music, singing, and then we have two more workshops this afternoon. So I look forward to spending the rest of the day with you. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. I'm honored to be here.
Me too. So do we leave? Do we leave the meeting? Is that what we do?
Can you hear me? They can't hear us, can they? Am I muted?
Yeah, they can.
That was a great job, you guys.
We log out and then we come back in a half an hour? That's okay. Thanks, Suzanne. I know. What are we going to do? Suzanne said she can still hear. Okay. All right. I'll see you guys in half an hour.